Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California. This is the nation's oldest public affairs discussion forum. I'm Dr. Ann W. Smith, the club's Arts Forum co-chair, and your program moderator for this evening. We're pleased to welcome any new club members who are here today and tuned in online. We welcome all of you in person and online as often as possible. And we're so excited to be with you in the Tony Rembe Rock Room. I'm extremely pleased and honored at today's meeting to welcome an old colleague. Well, not
it's
so
old.
old.
It's old.
It's pretty old.
Yeah,
pretty old. Into our Commonwealth Club conversation for tonight's meeting. Debbie Chin is Executive Director of Silicon Valley's Theater Works, a superb theater company led by Artistic Director Tim Bond, who and we were happy to have with us in 2021 for a theater panel. And Debbie's primary professional and volunteer career focuses on theater work that heals our society and bridges our cultural differences. That was seeded across a 13-generation saga, crossing continents. And over the past 25 years, she herself, having landed in the Bay Area first, has held a series of executive suite positions as executive director of California Shakespeare Festival, of Opera Parallel, the Carmel Bach Festival. She went to East to be head of Baltimore Center Stage, the Shakespeare Theater of New Jersey, and most recently of Anna Deavere Smith's projects. So Debbie's really cut across quite a wide executive swath in the arts. She's also served on the boards of the San Francisco Community Music Center and the Playwrights Foundation, the Chinese Cultural Center of San Francisco, and more recently as board president of Theater Bay Area, where I followed her, where I'm now the president. So thank you for passing the baton on.
No worries.
Most of the time. Tonight's meeting is about Dancing in Their Light, a daughter's unfinished memoir. And it's a biographical conversation that in this program we'll be conversing, exploring the research that brought forth Debbie's family's experiences, leaving China, and assimilating in the United States. It's a specifically Chinese-American immigration story. It's a compilation skillfully weaving together stories of the Chin family restaurant, the House of Mahjong, and the distinct personality of a Golden Age Polynesian floor show in a restaurant on Long Island. We'll have some time for a few audience questions near the end, and if you have a question, feel free to write it on the paper and bring it around to me, and I will manage the questions. I want to relate our discussion of the book to the public affairs kind of distinction of the Commonwealth Club. But first, we all try Memoir 1, right? We even get to Memoir 101, and this is actually doing the book, Memoir 600 or whatever. And I wanted to ask Debbie to summarize the various kinds of things that she did in order to get this wonderful book off the presses. I remember when she was getting started on it. So
yeah, it's about a 10-year project, and I never really intended to write a book. I was just going to document things from my younger cousins who really didn't know very much about our family history. And one of my cousins passed away rather early at the age of 45. She was our historian. And when she passed away, all of the history of our family just started to sit in boxes. And so I thought, well, I have no worldly goods to give anybody except probably a memory. And so that's my inheritance to them. And so I just began to put stories on Facebook about our restaurant and growing up in Long Island, what it was like to be a hula dancer. And my first job, as I say, was selling cigarettes at the age of 3. It's a true story. And there were no vending machines. My mother had a carton of a box of cartons of cigarettes that I had to take out, and I had to put them in a counter, and I would arrange them by color, and I stood on tiptoe to hand them to the customer on the other side. And cigarettes were 45 cents a pack in those days, and so they gave me $1, and I learned how to count change back. So that was my math class growing up. But so when I was telling these stories of what it was like to be in a restaurant in a Polynesian nightclub, which you don't see anymore, by the way, people remembered what the food tasted like. They remembered what the spare ribs looked like. They were reciting back to me every single memory that they had. One girl told me that I still have the coin purse your father gave me for my 16th birthday, and he put a coin in it and gave it to me for good luck, and I'd given it to my grandchildren. So these stories were popping up, and I thought, well, what was it about our restaurant that was so unique? Mm-hmm. And my father wrote a very modest 8-page, not even memoir. He just wrote it on a typewriter, and it was so thin, and I thought I want to dive in and find out more about what was behind that. But the crux of the story was capturing oral history from my mother's younger sister. And after my mother died, I really missed her voice. Mm-hmm. And I didn't keep any recordings of her. There's nothing that exists. And my aunt sounds exactly like my mother. And so I would go and visit with my aunt, and I would just take a recorder and have her just talk. And it was just wonderful to hear stories that I was told as a young girl, but I never really was interested in or remembered. And so I began to put that together with the restaurant story. But so that was about 8 years of talking to my aunt and getting things, bits and pieces, and there was no arc to it. But what really propelled me to write this and to be serious about this was when we started to hear and see the rise of anti-Asian hate in this country in 2017. And we heard the Chinese flu and the Kung flu virus, and I was assaulted right in Civic Center near Opera Parallel's office. I was told to go back to where I came from. I was living in Pebble Beach just as the 2016 election was clear who won. And Pebble Beach is a relatively safe area, and I was in the supermarket, and some person told me that your people are going to be out of this country soon. So there was no place to be safe, and I started to see these news reports of Asians being beat, spat upon. I mean, I was spat upon in front of my office at Opera Parallel. And I couldn't believe, why are we the enemy? And I began to think that there's got to be a sense of urgency about talking about the value of every immigrant in this country. And I had two choices. One is I could hibernate and during the pandemic and live in fear, because I did change how I went out. I didn't go out to go shopping during lunch hour. I got out and did all my errands very early in the morning, and I would stay in at 9 o'clock in the morning. I wouldn't go out because I didn't want to be attacked anymore. So I began to carry mace, and I thought, what is? So I just began to think about writing about my family's contributions to this country in every single industry that was nascent in the days when they just came here as young women, when my mother's siblings came here they were 17 years old and 20 years old, and they began to forge a pathway for this country in many ways. So it was an 8-year journey, but really it's sped up for the last 2 years.
Yes. And then it had to be done.
That had to be done.
Then it had to go to the
Yeah.
publisher. It had to be done. Great. And I think that comes across really well. But let's go back then to what really started. The whole early section of the book had we but whirled enough in time, as they say, and had you but materials and information, probably could have been longer. But it moves quite quickly. But it's of immense value, and so I'd love you to describe the situation in China's regional geography and politics that sort of was the backdrop that led to your family's decision to leave.
So it all began with the missionaries. So the missionaries were very important to my family, the Protestant missionaries in particular. And I talk about in the book that there is a man named Jesse Boardman Hartwell Jr. That's Jesse Boardman Hartwell. He was a Protestant missionary. He was from South Carolina, and he found a calling to go to China. He had always felt a calling to be in China. And he eventually moved to China, and he established the first Protestant missionary there. His wife started the first Protestant church. And this was a man who was there in China during the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was a civil war in China. It started in 1850 and it lasted well over a decade. And over 20 million people died in the Taiping Rebellion. 30 million were displaced. And it was against this backdrop that a young girl and her mother were escaping the rebellion, and they took refuge in a church. And it was this man's church. And he heard a cry from the young child, and the mother was dead, but the young child was lying next to her dead mother. And he rescued that little girl, and he adopted her, and he raised her. He named her Mary Hartwell. And Mary Hartwell is my great-grandmother. And so because Jesse Hartwell was from the United States, my great-grandmother was raised Western. She learned the Western language, and so she traveled to South Carolina, and so she was steeped in Western influence.
She was bilingual?
She was bilingual. And she was one of those people that Jesse Boardman Hartwell valued girls. And he was the man who actually saved my family. And my great-grandmother is the one that's seated second to the right holding a little baby. And next to her right is that big man as her husband. But behind them are their 3 boys, their 3 sons. And the boy in the middle is my grandfather, Frank. And so I look at this picture and I think this is one of the rare pictures that actually came out of China. And in my book, I talk about during the series of wars, all of my family fled China right away. They didn't have the luxury of just packing and someday we'll go to the United States. They had to get out of there. So very few photos in my family exist of that time because they were burned and they were just lost. And so I really treasure this one.
Yeah.
And this picture is of my mother and her. So Frank is my grandfather with his wife, and then that's all their kids. And my mother is the one on your left standing. And this is one of the rare photos of all of them as a family intact, because just a couple of years later, a series of war. China was always tortured by war. Another series of wars occurred and forced the family to flee. So there was the Taiping Rebellion that was key to the first wave of what was Kismet, I guess, and that my great-grandmother was saved by a Protestant missionary.
The Kismet effect.
And then
the next one was
the 2 others were the Nanjing, the Rape of Nanjing, the Japanese occupied China. It was the Second Sino-Japanese War.
And that was?
That was 1941 to 45 or 46, somewhere around there. And this was a civil war, and the Japanese occupied China and invaded China in 1937. And if anybody knows Iris Chang, and you've read her book, The Rape of Nanjing, she describes the horror. And these are just some of the photos of what the Japanese did to Chinese civilians. They used them for bayonet practice. They used them for experiments. One of the reasons why my mother's brother, the only boy in the family, was told to go inland in China was because they were afraid he'd be kidnapped and used as a medical experiment, which the Japanese did. This is another photo of some of the example of the atrocities of what the Japanese did in China. And in this backdrop, my mother's older siblings had left, but my mother and her two younger siblings stayed behind. And this was the period where they had nothing to eat or do. The Japanese torched all the fields. They just burned everything. And my mother told me that we were told to hide everything that could be perceived as being anti-Japanese. Because Frank, my great-grandfather, was because Mary Hartwell, who was Western, gave birth to Frank. And so Frank, my grandfather, worked for Shell Oil. And his brother worked for the railroad. So they were Western people. They were prime targets for kidnapping or killing. Mm-hmm. So during this backdrop, my mother could not be perceived as being aligned with the Westerns because of Frank. And so she was told to burn all of their photos, all the poems, all the music, all the sheet music, all the instruments. And at that time, they had a bathtub with a chimney to keep the water warm. And as my aunt tells me, the burning was so relentless that the chimney broke down. Mm. So very little photos made it out, but they just had to burn everything that they owned. And my mother talks about starvation, that there was nothing but really turnips, and they learned to stir fry in turnips with water, and oil was rationed. And my mother told me the story about they would try to buy rice, but the rice oftentimes was mixed with sand, so they just couldn't eat. Ugh. But what my mother told me is the way that she and her siblings survived and got through the hardship is they used to sing to each other. They used to recite poetry, and they used to dance, and that escape helped them mentally escape the atrocities.
So tell me again about their education in China.
So they went to my mother. They all went to different schools because my mother is there are 7 siblings, and my mother is the 5th one. So she's one of the youngest ones. But they all had different. She went to a Catholic high school. The nuns were good to our family because they helped one of my aunts get out of China. One of my mother's siblings witnessed a Japanese soldier kill her classmate. And when my aunt Grace came back to tell her father, they immediately told her to get out of the country because if the Japanese found Grace, Grace would certainly be killed or slaughtered or whatever. So they talked to the nuns. And let me tell you the power of the nuns. The nuns had a connection in a college in the Midwest. And so the only way to get to China was by boat. There were no planes then. And so they took Grace to the dock. And there was a boat there, and every spot in that boat was filled except one, a girl that hadn't shown up. And the girl was late, and so my aunt got in that last spot and and escaped China. She was 17 when she came here,
by herself,
knowing nobody except the nuns, and knowing very little English. So it was so I talk about how this influx of escaping China and coming to the United States, which really was a country that didn't really welcome Chinese, as I talk about it in the Chinese Exclusion Act, as you know. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was designed to kick Chinese out. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't know,
started in California.
It did in California, and this is some of the what you typically saw as propaganda about how Chinese were just not welcomed in this country, and the hysteria. And this is because the Chinese built the railroads, and we took away jobs and all that stuff, but this was relentless propaganda to campaign to keep Chinese out. And the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 expired, and there were subsequent acts to keep the Chinese out, and the subsequent acts required Chinese to show more documentation of residency in order to stay here. You had to, if railroad workers left to go to China to visit their families, they were not allowed to come back. So about 20,000 laborers were left stranded as a result of one of the many acts to keep Chinese out. So it was against this point of history that I began to think that it just may be possible with this this rise of anti-Asian hate in 2017, that maybe there'd be another Exclusion Act. And I really began to wonder that we're very close about if you recall, the national conversation was build the wall, deport the children, get them out. And that's why we saw a lot of more Asian hate in this country.
And but each sibling had a different immigration story.
Each one got out on their own. So each one out. The older ones got out because they came here for education, and they found men who got them here. My mother happened to. The story about my father. That's a whole separate segue. But my father was born in Canton, now known as Guangzhou. And he, China at that time, in 1911, first became a republic. The last emperor of China was a 6-year-old emperor. And so China became a republic in 1911 under Sun Yat-sen. And my father was born in 1915, and it was against this very wobbly new government in China that his mother sent him to the United States. And it was in Buffalo, New York, of all places. And Buffalo, New York, in my research, there was an influx of South Chinese people going to Buffalo, New York for some reason. Don't know. There's a Chinatown there at one time. And
it's the climate, right? No.
I don't know. What Canton is like really balmy, and Buffalo is like just the opposite. I don't know. But I guess when you immigrate to the country,
somebody told you the story.
But I think it was also because of the quotas. You know, the quota, there was part of one of the many acts that was enacted limited the number of Chinese who could come into this country at 105. 105 a year. 105 only in this country. So the progressive acts, as you saw by the propaganda, really caused a firestorm in this country, in Congress, which enacted all these laws to keep Chinese out. And by the way, the Chinese Exclusion Act is the only act that is specifically named for a race. There's no Japanese exclusion. There's no Irish exclusion. It's the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it's just important to know that, and that hasn't changed. So my father came by boat, and he was what they call a paper son. If you don't know what that is, paper son is there were the laborers on the railroad claimed an offspring, and there's underground papers to claim someone coming in as their son. And my father got off the boat, and he was told to listen to a code of somebody naming their village, and he would go to that man, and that man gave him a name. And we don't know if Chin, spelled C-H-I-N-N, is really our last name, because he used C-H-I-N, but Americans pronounce it Chun, or there's different intonations, so we think it's spelled C-H-I-N. But if you look at the Chinese immigration in this country, there's also a wide swath of Chinese named C-H-I-N-N in Seattle. And my father used to say that was to throw them off the scent, because Chin, C-H-I-N-N, is not a Chinese name. It's an Anglo name. It's an Anglo name. So I don't know if my last name's Chin. It could be Hartwell. I have no idea what we. So it's just fascinating to learn about how to assimilate. You had to change your identity. You had to change your name, and you had to just change your culture.
I think people don't understand the many complexities of Chinese immigration and the cultural changes that came as they came to work on the railroads, in the camps, and around when in coming to California and then other parts. For example, Chinese opera. There was Chinese opera in California in the mid-19th century. As people came to do the railroad, they brought culture with them.
And the railroads were built by the barons, right? Crocker, Stanford, Crocker theorized that if the Chinese could build the Great Wall, they could build a railroad, and they needed people to go through the granite to go through to California, and to blast through it, which the Chinese invented dynamite, but if you recall.
Yeah.
So and there were, for every Chinese that was blown up, trying to blast through the Sierras, there were more Chinese to come. So we were just disposable to the railroad barons, and so when you think about when you think about this country, that the Amtrak, I mean, all of these tracks were built by the Chinese by hand, by laborers, and it was just exploitation of the Chinese in this country, a shameful exploitation.
Massive exploitation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I talk about that. There was the Taiping Rebellion, and there was the rape of Nanjing. There was a third wave of violence that caused my family to leave China, and that was the civil war between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists with Mao Zedong. So that was another Chinese civil war.
I think the Americans were maybe more aware of those
times. Yeah. And so Mao Zedong, of course, won that, and that became the start of the Communist Party in China. And my father, when he had settled here, eventually joined the Marines, and he was in the intelligence. And that is how he got to know that Mao was going to seal the borders. And he got my mother and my sister, who was born in China, and her mother out of China on the last military ship, the SS Adder.
So because he was in the military,
in the intelligence. Yeah, he was in the Marines.
That was pretty good thinking there. So the family's always had a way of dealing with the situation.
Yeah, and don't forget, these were before the days of phones, so there was no way to communicate once you got. It's sort of like saying, I'll meet you in Russia, and you just, as a 17-year-old or 20-year-old girl, you go and you try to find your way and connect, and they had connections through two major important organizations. Mm-hmm. One is the China Institute, which was founded in 1926.
Does that still exist?
It still exists. It was founded to foster bicultural relationships between China and the United States through exchanges with professors and with students as a way to appreciate Chinese art in both sides of the continent. But that was a resource to go to in this country. You went to the China Institute to find out who you could know to put you in touch with somebody as a way. So they helped a lot of my family find who to connect with. And the other is the Asia Society. So the Asia Society was created in 1956 by John D. Rockefeller. And both those organizations are still very much at play, and they still very much are committed to supporting a true exchange of understanding between China and the United States. So those two agencies were sort of like our Underground Railroad, where my mother's siblings learned to go and find somebody there who would connect you to find somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who could find your aunt.
Mm-hmm. So you'd meet in such and such city on such and such day, but you weren't quite sure where.
Right,
and
right.
You couldn't text them.
Right, and you had to be careful because Chinese weren't allowed in. So you had to be very discreet about finding your connections.
You're aware of Angel Island and immigration, the immigration stories here of the people being brought and held on Angel Island, some for months and months and months and months before being allowed into the Bay, into San Francisco. It's quite another immigration story, one of the history of Asian immigration in the United States. It's a really, really complex, huge story, as it should be for such a huge population, and a significant part of what's making us great.
And all of my mother's siblings made it out through different times. They found each other. The only person who didn't make it out was my grandfather Frank. Because my grandfather Frank
He believed, huh?
He had a concubine. He cheated on his wife, and he had a concubine, and the concubine was my mother's classmate in high school. So there was all this turmoil happening here. But Frank made the decision to stay behind with his concubine, with whom he had a son. And his last words to his wife was, "I'll see you in heaven." And years later, the concubine died, and Frank had a change of heart. He wanted to come to this country, and there was no way you could. He was in communist China. The borders were sealed, and there were intermediaries that tried to find a way to get Frank to go to Hong Kong to meet someone there who would get under an assumed name, then get him on a ship to come to the United States. And Frank makes his way from Beijing to Hong Kong, which is an arduous trip. He had to go incognito because he was well known. And remember, he worked for Shell Oil. He was an executive, and he was famous. And if the communists heard that he was ever going to make their way towards some port, he'd be detected. So he went by an assumed name. The intermediary who met him didn't know he was going through an assumed name, and got to the port, was looking for assumed name. Frank had a different name, and Frank missed the connection and missed his opportunity to come to the United States. So he died in China. So he was the only one who did come out.
So that was the journey out.
My mother said that was, karma. She wasn't very happy with it.
Okay.
Yeah, she was. My mother and her siblings were really, very upset with their father when he did that. But they felt that was karma. That was divine, a divine sign. You shouldn't cheat on your wife. And so my mother's siblings really never forgave their father for what he did.
So the whole family was Christian as a result.
Some were Quaker. So each of the siblings, when they came here, found a different church to go to. They found a different denomination. My mother was Catholic.
Uh-huh.
So.
Uh-huh. Okay, that in itself is a whole segment.
There's a whole segment in the book that didn't make it in the book about how my mother's piousness and how she felt about the Catholic Church, and it ties into the restaurant that we owned, because the restaurant was so successful and very popular that the cardinals from China came to Mahjong because they were from her hometown, and so over the course of 10 years, our family restaurant was frequented by the only 3 Chinese cardinals. It was so this restaurant that my parents began is actually the core piece of the book, and it was always meant to be the book. And then this whole thing about anti-immigration and kung flu and all that stuff that caused me to add the part about the immigrants in the front part.
Well, the exclusion. Just going back to this for a sec. The Exclusion Act was not the only anti-Chinese act. There were a couple of others that people have probably not heard of at all. Just mention what those were. Well,
there was the Scott Act. There was the Geary Act. Of course, there was the Immigration Act of 1924. The United States has had many immigration acts, to be clear. But the one that was pertaining to the Chinese was progressive to keep them out, to make it harder for them to come back in, harder for them to stay. Like I mentioned, if the laborers left to go to China to visit their family in China, it was hard to come back in. The government enacted acts of law to keep them out if they would come back in. So this is part of this country's DNA, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think that we are, I hate to say it, at large, very anti-immigrant focused in this country. And it's just too bad, because I talk about how my family of immigrants and your family of immigrants have done so much for this country. And it was always been my hope that people who read my book, would think about their own lineage and what their grandparents did here in this country.
Yes, and that's part of the what do I want to say? The paradox of the United States.
It is, yeah.
On the one hand and on the other hand. So we'll get now to this is, on the one hand, so many people arrived from all these different circumstances whether it was on a boat from China, whether it was on a slave ship, whether it was in an airplane, whether it was from the south, the north, the west, or the east. And people managed to find a way to make a better life for themselves and the community. And no exception here. And keep on going.
Yep. The one, I must say, the one tragedy of assimilating for me has been because my parents wanted to fit in and not be ostracized, which they kind of were. And don't forget, when they came to the United States, it was 1949, and they moved to Long Island, which was very homogenized in those days. In the 50s and 60s, and in the late 60s, the Vietnam War was being televised on TV. So when people saw the brutality of the Vietnam War, my family growing up, people thought we were Vietnamese, and people they vilified us because they saw us killing American soldiers on TV. So it was that hard to fit in. And so my mother and father did not want my siblings and me to speak any Chinese. They did not want us to be, thought of as a target. So I don't speak Chinese, and I think that is, and many first, second generation people also don't speak. Yo-Yo Ma does not speak Japanese, by the way. And I think that's just a shame to have to hide your cultural identity. And I think it's many ways covert linguistic cleansing. And had we been allowed to be ourselves, I think we could have fostered and kept the Chinese
and not so
family.
covert.
Not so covert, yeah.
Don't speak that here.
Yeah.
Whether it's a Native American tongue, or whether it's a European tongue, or Chinese as well. But you did land here, and now it's time to turn to after you were evacuated from China, the situation in the United States and New York that influenced your parents' and your grandparents' adaptation to living here in the United States, and then assimilating on Long Island. And everybody here knows that, maybe describe Long Island is...
Long Island is this part of New York. It looks like that.
Yeah, there it is.
And New York City is to your left. And the area that I grew up in was Nassau County, which is the area in green. And if you go in your far right, that would be what you might know as Montauk Point. The Hamptons is probably the most famous part of Long Island. But my mother and father came here through San Francisco, and they lived in San Francisco for a while. My father had, this is something that I think nobody knows about a corporation named Goodyear Tire. Goodyear Tire in 1944 offered factory education for Chinese boys in the United States because they were this is part of the cordial relationship that China and the United States once had through Goodyear Tire. And Goodyear had four spots for Chinese boys. My father was one of them, to learn about factory cost basis, cost analysis, all of the things that factory work. Accounting, my father would study accounting. And this was a wonderful gift that Goodyear did for immigrant men. And because of that business background, my father was able to eventually start his own business. And he when he came to San Francisco, he ran a Goodyear tire factory someplace in the city. And then they migrated to New York, and that was where there was a Chinatown there. There wasn't really Chinatown here yet. And he always wanted to work for himself. And through circumstances, our family gravitational pull ended up in the tri-state area. But Long Island was all potato farms back in those days. And
very flat.
Long Island was known for its Long Island potatoes. And in fact, when we lived at our first home in Syosset, New York, if you dug deep enough, you could still smell potatoes in the soil. And Long Island was also known for the first suburb that was built in the United States. It was called Levittown. And it was started by a man named Bill Levitt, and that's Levittown. It looked like that. And Bill Levitt created a suburb that is replicated everywhere today. Suburbs are modeled after what Bill Levitt created. But Bill Levitt also had a covenant that anybody who bought a home in Levittown, they would not sell the home to what he called then Negroes. Because he felt that if they sold a home to Negroes, to people of color, that the value of the property would decrease. So it was quite racist in Long Island when we were there. And you can research many stories about a man named Robert Moses who built the state park, and so how he designed the bridges, which were low, were in theory to keep the buses coming in from New York and bring the Puerto Ricans in. So there's a whole history of Long Island that is quite sad. But we grew up about 8 miles from Levittown, in a place called Syosset. And that is where my father bought an old potato barn. And what he was told when he was settling into very white, homogenized Long Island was, if you want to be accepted, join the Kiwanis Club.
Yes.
And he joined the Kiwanis Club in Huntington, and he networked, and he was told, just network and just tell your dream, tell your story. And there was a banker who ran the Long Island National Bank, and the banker took a liking to my dad, and my father was he was a visionary, and he said, I want to own a restaurant, and there's a potato barn that's just sitting there, and it's right on the turnpike, and the banker gave him the $60,000 to buy the barn with just a handshake, which you don't do these days.
Wow.
And so the restaurant was called Mahjong Restaurant, named after the game, but my father also loved to gamble, so there's a lot of that in the book too. And that's the
How did people respond, do you think, to that as the name of the restaurant?
They loved it because people played Mahjong, the game, so the name Mahjong was very recognizable. And he didn't want to name it Chin's Restaurant. He just named it something.
Yeah.
Something
that was creative.
And so that is my mother at the counter of Mahjong, and it was very simple. My father went to Chinatown in New York, in Manhattan. He would drive in to pick up chefs in Chinatown and drive them to Long Island to cook at Mahjong because they made authentic food. And then at the end of the shift, he'd drive them back to Chinatown, which is an hour each way, back and forth, because you couldn't find any Chinese chefs on Long Island. There simply weren't any. So he just went in a station wagon and picked up 5 chefs and brought them back. And then eventually it became too much, so he built a dormitory underneath the restaurant, which was illegal. He didn't believe in coding. He just built it. And we were told never to go down there. I was told, don't go down there. It's girls aren't allowed down there. And I snuck down there. They had a gambling den. They had smoking in there, and it was like a little Chinatown. They had the laundry with the undershirts hanging on string, and they had pictures of naked girls down there. So that was their little Chinatown. And so he built this for them to keep help, because that way he wouldn't lose them by any chef saying, I don't want to make the commute anymore. But this is his business spirit about taking care of his employees. And it's one of the first examples of how to care for your staff that I've taken with me. And I try to emulate at places that I work now, at TheaterWorks, and other places.
And then that's a common tactic in Chinese industry and business, to have places for the people who work there to live there also. Yeah.
And our home was only about half a mile from the restaurant, so it was very convenient to be there. And this is one of the pictures of my father. Typical, actually, he was always helping young kids. And that young girl was one of the people who contacted me on Facebook to say, your father taught me how to use chopsticks. Yeah.
He probably taught a lot of people how to use chopsticks.
It was a very simple restaurant. That used to be the potato barn. That was the barn that he made into a restaurant.
And who were the customers?
The customers were people from the Kiwanis Club. And this restaurant was situated across from the Syosset Hospital. And does anybody remember Grauman's Electronics in those days?
Yes.
Grauman's was located just down the street from Jericho Turnpike. Grauman's was responsible for the lunar module. So all of the workers from Grauman would come to the restaurant. And by the way, work ended about 4 o'clock for those factory workers. So they would all come in about 4 o'clock and come to the bar. And that was when when I helped to wait on them at the bar by putting toothpicks and cherries and putting them in their little martini glasses. But that became so popular, and it eventually needed renovation. That's a typical scene of what a dinner looked like at the restaurant. It was always filled with people and noise. And I look at this and I think, we don't eat like this anymore. We don't commune like this anymore. And then eventually, the restaurant got so popular that we had to build an extension. So during the late 50s and 60s, there was a huge wave of interest in Polynesia. South Pacific, the book came out. Missions Hawaii came out. There was a huge interest. Flower Drum Song was playing on Broadway, directed by Gene Kelly, by the way. Hawaii came out. Hawaii became a state. And then in Disneyland, they were going to build the Tiki Room was being built there. And in Hawaii, the Ala Moana Shopping Center, which was the biggest outdoor shopping center in the world at that time, was about ready to add a whole Polynesian entertainment. So all this interest in Hawaii as our 50th state was just reverberating around the country. And so my parents took us to Hawaii to get a sense of what this phenomenon was all about. And we got the Polynesian bug. We just fell in love with that culture. And Dad had the idea that he would add a Polynesian nightclub. So this is an artist rendering, but I'd like you to note the facade is all made of stone. And that stone was put together hand by hand by laborers who took a whole bunch of rock and cut them, measured them, and put them in piece by piece into that facade. There's no other building in the world like it, as I like to say. And it had a dramatic archway, and it just became the foundation for a new Polynesian show. And that's me in the middle with my fake hair. And I was 12 years old, being thrust into this land of Polynesia and learning all these dances. And so my upbringing as a young girl was about how to I grew away from selling cigarettes and putting toothpicks into cherries into becoming a Polynesian dancer. And so the nightclub was extremely popular. This was the days when men had to wear a coat to go into a dining room. Mm-hmm. If you didn't have a coat, we would give you a coat from the coat check room. You don't see coat check rooms anymore in restaurants, and you don't see phone booths anymore in restaurants. And I talk about in this Gilded Age of restaurants, what the architecture was like in a restaurant. If you go into any restaurant now, it does not look like what it looked like back then, when you could actually have a conversation and talk to one another without screaming. And then if you wanted to take a phone call, you didn't talk at the table. You went into the phone booth and did your call there, but you actually had a conversation around a meal. Of course, every Polynesian show has a fire dancer, as you know. And this is a real Samoan chief. He's from Samoa. His name is Chief Tofi, and that is what he used to do and scare the bejesus. I grew up doing promotions for the restaurants. All I knew was how to sell and hawk, and that is me. That is an old me. And then we had, it was kitsch. It was all, this is all tying into the fervor of what it was like to be in the Polynesian environment. And so remember, this is in New York. As far as you couldn't get to Hawaii easily in those days. There weren't flights from United that went several times a day. It was hard to get there. So we built a land of Polynesia on Long Island. There was also a Chinese New Year and all those celebrations, and so what I found fascinating about this history of the Chinese, of our restaurant, is that there were people that would come with their families for dinner every Sunday. People just came as families to the restaurant where they ate, or they would do takeout every Sunday. And so this ritual of families going to someplace together is what I was so intrigued to know about, because we don't do that now. You know, there was no DoorDash in those days.
Were you putting forth a Chinese menu and a Polynesian?
It was continental, but
same restaurant.
But Chinese food in those days was sort of like La Choy and Chungking. You know, there really wasn't. But my father, because he went and got those Chinese chefs, they brought their recipes from China, and there are no written recipes because they just make it up. And the restaurant had lobster and steak, and it had stuff for American palates, but they had the introduction of real Cantonese food, which was
Here's a menu.
The menu for So it was really authentic for those days, and there was no other cuisine except Cantonese. Szechuan hadn't been really around. There wasn't sushi in those days. It was just Cantonese food that was beyond the canned food that you could get at home. La Choy and those were made for the railroad workers.
Yeah, longevity noodles, barbecued roast pig. Everybody go out to dinner afterwards. Let's see, treasured pork rolls, jaded capon.
And the other thing that's interesting about the restaurant menu is that the reason why people say, I can't find spare ribs like that anymore, or I can't find a dish that tastes like that, because we don't harvest food like that anymore. You know, we source food differently. The soil is different. The environment's different. Grains are different. Everything is different. So a pig does not taste the same now as it did back then. And we had a mantra, which was leave all the fat on. The more fat, the better. And while you're at it, add some salt to it.
Yeah.
So my father, who was a chemist, by the way, he just loved to experiment in the kitchen. And he would come up with these dishes that were homegrown, and they'd be the house special. And you never knew what was in it, because it was never quite the same. Every day was a different house special. But that's what brought people back.
Yes, it was a family routine.
Yeah.
And, well, no wonder you went into theater. I'm looking at there's a program that was published. These things, this wasn't just go to the restaurant. This was, this is a program from
So Chinese New Year. So the
1979.
restaurant was open every day except for 2 days, Chinese New Year, one day to get ready and one day to celebrate. And in a true act of philanthropy, my parents would close the restaurant down. They would sell tickets. There was a line to get into this place because there was a show, there was a banquet, there was just nonstop entertainment. But the proceeds went to the Chinese Cultural Center of Long Island. And my mother and father always remembered how they had to burn all their artifacts and all of their precious possessions. And on Long Island, there was a Chinese Cultural Center whose mission was to save Chinese culture. And so every year, all the proceeds went to that with the Chinese Cultural Center. And so we grew up in this era of philanthropy, which is how I learned how to give back and how to form a career in the arts. And my mother and her siblings were very modest about their contributions. And my mother would just, she'll probably send a lightning bolt when I tell you this, but she and my father would both send food to the Syosset Hospital for the nurses who worked the graveyard shift, the doctors, so they would have something to eat. And when she heard that any of the customers' children were going to have an operation or surgery, she would bring toys from the gift shop and leave them at the desk for the child to have when they came out of surgery. Those gentle acts of kindness is how they operated. And they just wanted to give back, and they wanted to not just to buy favors, but they really believed in feeding and taking care of people that couldn't take care of themselves, because they remembered what it was like
to be hungry
and to be forgotten. And so we've never forgotten that gratitude of being in this country that did not really accept them at first. Eventually, my parents became very solid citizens by virtue of their philanthropic nature.
Do you think I mean, you talk about this, and I noticed there was this printed program lasting from 7:30 fireworks all the way to a raffle at the end, and there was ceremonies and speeches and entertainment and dance music. I mean, it's logical.
It was
to go
nonstop.
in.
And, my father used to say, someday you should own this restaurant. And I thought, forget it, I don't want to own a restaurant, because you never sleep, right? You
Yeah.
never sleep. And we never saw each other. To be clear, the restaurant business is not glamorous at all. For those of you who ever worked in a restaurant, we children lived on opposite sides of the clock than our parents, so we never saw each other. When it came time to us to go to school, our parents were sleeping. We took ourselves to school, and then when the only time we saw our parents was when we worked at the restaurant. And so hours for us were, we just worked till the restaurant was open till 2 in.the morning. So we just worked nonstop. And all my siblings and I really know is how to work hard.
Yeah.
We weren't, we didn't ask for a day. We don't dare ask for a day off. You just worked, and you did whatever was needed to
Just go out and do it.
go out and do it. And do it with joy. Don't complain about it. And to learn to find something to like about it, basically.
So these would be, I would think, these are some of the important lessons you've learned that you're using in an arts management career, and that this could sway one towards being involved in the arts and giving and sharing and the philanthropic approach. So,
And the other thing I wonder is, what is it about the business model that my parents had? They had customers that stayed with them for many, many years.
what do you think it was? The business model.
Well, it's the business model I've tried to emulate as a CEO and executive directors in the room. What I'm talking about. That it's about building a sense of community, about being a sense of belonging. If a new customer came to the restaurant and my father heard about it, have a drink on me. And they would always call you by your name. We were Cheers before Cheers was even around. So that new customer would coming back. So as I run theater companies and opera companies, I think, what is it about the experience that would keep our audiences coming back? And I think the experience happens from before the time they come in the door. It's how you answer the phone. It's how you process the reservation. And this is why my mother used to send my brother and me as young kids to go in the parking lot and open the doors for the customers. And then say, hi. Well, we were like 5 or 6. Hi, come on in. I mean, what other restaurant did that? And so you put them in a good mood. We opened the door for them. And then at the end, we say goodbye. And so so I've sort of emulated this at Cal Shakes, where we used to work, and from soup to nuts. And then after a while, it becomes just part of what you love to do. And I've learned to build staff who like to do that. You'd be surprised how many staff don't like to do that. But
well, that's
right.
The part of the hard work, the sharing,
Yeah.
and staying with it, the long hours. Gee, sounds like an arts job to me. For all of us who are involved in the arts. Well, we have about 5 more minutes. If anyone had a question they wanted to write down and bring up to me, now's the time to do it. And I wanted to ask Debbie if there was recall any moments during your arts management career that took you back to, oh my God, this was like mahjong all over again, but in a positive way.
I do this. I think about this all the time. I look and I try to replicate everything that I learned in the restaurant in every job that I have, whether it's a campaign or how I greet people or my networks. And sometimes the customers don't like what you do, and you have to learn how to apologize and how to extend and that these are not every customer that came to the restaurant liked their experience. Some complained about a lot of things. To be sure, many customers told us that we were not wanted there, and so we had to learn how to go beyond that to try to welcome them back. And if it didn't work, it didn't work. But I also learned about resiliency, but I also learned about how to truly look at everybody individually, because every customer is different. They want, if somebody didn't want salt, fine, I don't have salt. It's whatever you want, whatever will make you comfortable. But there was a point. My father did not tolerate bullies. If anybody called us a derogatory name, they were asked to leave. And many people did. So we stood on principle as well. And so because we stood on principle, people knew that they were safe. Jews came to our restaurant a lot, and some people accused us of harboring Jewish customers. And so we just got at it from both sides.
Very important lessons. How difficult, maybe you may not know this, but how difficult is it now if families want to immigrate? Seems to me it has a lot to do with their education and
It depends on where you're from.
Yeah.
Depends on where you're from. don't
And who
think?
you know.
Right? I think it depends on what color you are,
Yep.
to be honest. I think there's some privilege. You look at these news reports about if you happen to be brown or black, we've got
Uyghurs.
more hurdles to get through. I mean, you talked about people coming on boats, but many immigrants are coming in stuffed into trucks and trains, right, to come here because it's inhospitable to immigrants these days. One hopes that we will move towards a new place of understanding in this country about that everybody's here that has value, no matter what you look like, that together it truly is the melting pot. But we have to make some serious policy changes.
And those policy changes have yet to be adopted, and brought forward.
Well, and I think we see whoever the composition of the Congress is or whatever. But my parents also, when they became citizens, the first thing they did was they registered to vote. And my mother never missed an election. She was very clear on who she wanted to vote for, and she voted in every election, local and national. And so I have taken that mantle because I do believe that it's a right that we shouldn't squander, and we can make a difference by who we elect. But I've always been interested in my organizations and arts organizations how to bring people towards a place of civic literacy and understanding and activism.
Yes.
Because my parents and my family were activists. To survive, you had to be an activist.
That's an essential part. Being the advocate, being the activist. As some recent elections in Georgia have shown up, that all the hardships that were put in the way, and the people just showed up and voted. So you got to show up and vote. That's our public affairs note for the day.
There you go. Glad I could slip it in.
Absolutely. Well, it's about closing time, so I want to. That went by faster
It
than
did go
you
by-
thought,
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
it? So I want to thank Debbie Chin so much for joining me in this conversation about your book, Dancing in Their Light, A Daughter's Unfinished Memoir. We'll wait for chapter 2. It's by Strange Fate Publications, published this past year. And we encourage you, the copies will be available outside and through the Commonwealth Club. And we encourage you to see the impact of that upbringing through Debbie's management practices at Theater Works, where she is now, and take advantage, go to performances, take advantage of the rich variety of theater and other arts performances that we have available in the Bay Area. And you can tell your friends they can listen to this program in a few days on the website in our recordings podcast section. I think it's a YouTube channel. And Debbie, I'm so pleased we did this.
Well, thank you to everybody for being here and for listening, and thank you everybody who's tuning in. But this is just a great way to bring us all together, and I'm just so honored to have you all here. Thank you.
Yes.
You got her gavel.
Yep. Yes. And Debbie,
Yes.
thank you for bringing the arts live back to the Commonwealth Club. And now, this meeting of celebrating the 120th year of the existence of the Commonwealth Club of California, the nation's oldest public affairs forum, is adjourned.